All right, it's 2:01 on the nose, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you, everyone who is showing up today, virtually showing up today. My name is Alex Zorowski. I'm a public health educator with the Washington Poison Center, and we're going to spend the next hour or so talking about vaping. There's a whole lot to cover, so we're going to dive right in. But first, a big thank you to the East Valley Community Coalition, specifically Kirsten Fuchs, who's been helping me get all this organized and share the message that this has been happening. And thank you for being here. It really, this is a fun presentation for me to give, and I always like it when we got more folks joining in. Since my video is off, this is me, and if you could take a moment to go ahead and type in the chat box where you're tuning in from. That kind of gives us a sense of our reach, or specifically city or town. And as Kirsten asked me to remind everyone, if you would like a certificate to show that you attended this training, please put your contact info in the chat box as well. An email address will be just fine. That way we can make sure everyone gets their certificate. All right, so some housekeeping to go over. Everyone's doing it so far, but please remain muted throughout. It facilitates everything a little more smoothly, and ask questions in the chat box. So I'm going to do my best to periodically lay eyes on that to make sure I don't miss anything, and I'll do my best to answer those either as I see them, or I'll wait until section ends to address them. And in worst case, if I'm really running behind, if my pacing is lagging, I'll get to everything I can by the end. And anything I don't answer directly on this webinar, go ahead and ask the question in the chat box anyway, and I will do follow-up. So that any follow-up messaging we send out, I'll be sure to answer any and all questions I can. And a reminder that this webinar is being recorded, so we can share out the slide deck as well as the recording. All right, so here's our agenda for the day. We're gonna discuss the Poison Center, who we are and what we do. We're gonna provide an overview of nicotine first off, and the vaping devices associated with nicotine, and then we're going to discuss some nicotine-specific public health issues. We're then going to switch substances and talk about vaping cannabis, as well as some public health issues specific to cannabis. So first off, let's talk about the Poison Center. So for us, we define poison very, very broadly. A poison for us is anything, any product or substance that is even potentially harmful if it's used in the wrong way, by the wrong person, or in the wrong amount. So that's a huge definition. That can include household products and plants and cleaners, bites and stings from animals, as well as medications and other substances. So our mission is to prevent and reduce harm from poisoning through expertise, collaboration, and education. So we're doing that last one today. We're doing some education. And we've been doing this in one form or another for over 60 years. The Poison Center has existed in one form or another for over 60 years. Oh, someone just asked a question that they missed the earlier webinar on cannabis. Yeah, we can make sure that you access, we can get that recording out to you, because we did record the previous one. All righty, so this is the Poison Center helpline. This is the National Poison Center helpline. So you can call this number from anywhere in the country, and it'll route you to a local poison center based on your area code. We are always open. 2 a.m. or 2 p.m. someone will answer. A nurse or a pharmacist or a specialist in poison information will help you out. You can call us in an emergency or just to get information. They're happy to take info calls. We're absolutely free, so you never have to worry about billing or insurance or anything like that. We are also confidential, so the same HIPAA laws that apply to a doctor's office also protect your privacy with the Poison Center. And we have interpretation services for anyone who would like. All right, so we're just going to dive in to vaping definitions now. So first off, vape devices. There are so many terms for these, but they essentially all refer to these battery-operated devices. The goal is to heat up a substance to create an aerosol, which users inhale, they breathe in. Now notice we've crossed out vapor and replaced with aerosol because there's a misnomer there. A lot of the marketing around these devices have focused for quite a few years on vaping, and vaping implies water vapor. And what is released from the plume of these is not a water vapor, it is an aerosol. So that right there gives you a little hint at the marketing of these devices. So the idea behind vaporization is to heat up a substance just short of combustion temperature without it actually catching on fire. So if I say combustion, I'm referring to like smoking a cigarette. That would be combusting. So there are other terms for these. You may see e-cigarette, e-cig, e-hookah, vape, mod, vape, so many others. If you're looking in the literature, you might see eds or ends. You won't see those outside of like journal articles all that often. So what are these things? Well, there's a huge amount of variance with these, but they all loosely consist of the same component. There's a battery, which gives power to a heating element, which heats up liquid in a cartridge or a tank. Now that liquid then is aerosolized and then breathed in or inhaled. Now folks vape a whole variety of stuff. They might vape nicotine, and that's a lot of what we're going to talk about today. If you ever hear the term e-juice, it's generally referring to something that'll have nicotine. Folks might also vape cannabis in a couple of different forms. We'll talk about flower versus concentrate. And I want to acknowledge that we're not going to talk about this so much today, but it is theoretically possible to vape other substances, other drugs as well. So starting with nicotine. Well, what is nicotine exactly? First and foremost, it's a plant. Nicotine is naturally found in the tobacco plant. And it appears in many different products, including pesticides. This is actually why this is its main function in the tobacco plant. If a bug takes a bite out of a tobacco leaf, they typically die. It also appears in various smoking and vaping products. But whoops, I jumped ahead of that. So including cigarettes, cigars, pipes, and others. All right, so we're going to just dive into some acute clinical effects. So this basically means short-term intoxication. And I want to emphasize, and this kind of goes back to our earlier definition of a poison, there are numerous ways in which one can take in a substance. And so for nicotine, we're going to talk about inhalation, ingestion, and absorption. And oftentimes the severity of an exposure will depend on how something is on that route of transmission or exposure. So the Poison Center, this is how we catalog or categorize calls to us. On the left column here, we see mild to moderate. We get a lot of calls about upset stomach or nausea and vomiting, some dizziness, headaches, tremor, so that's kind of a trembling. We might also see increased heart rate and higher blood pressure. In lower doses, nicotine generally acts like a stimulant. And one very extreme severe example of that, we actually get calls for folks experiencing seizures if they've had a high enough dose. Now, what's weird though, outside of seizures, high levels of nicotine will actually start to act like a depressant. So they'll bring on, it can bring on lethargy or folks feeling really sleepy, really exhausted, confusion, weakness, actually a lowering of the heart rate and blood pressure. And in some cases, we've had calls with folks who are having respiratory distress or they're having trouble breathing. So what is e-juice? E-juice, it's typically comprised of these 4 different ingredients. You got, for the most part, liquid nicotine. Some we'll tease this apart a little later, but some products will claim that they just have flavor and no nicotine. There's also going to be propylene glycol and vegetable glycerin. Now, these both are agents that help aerosolize that nicotine. And then oftentimes there is flavoring added as well. Folks can buy these in pre-made containers, or sometimes folks will buy the components and mix them themselves, or a vape shop or a smoke shop will mix it right then and there in front of you. And there is a huge range in concentrations of all of these elements here, all these ingredients, including nicotine. So starting with the devices themselves, there are 2 broad categories here. The oldest and first devices on the market have used what's called freebase nicotine. And then we start later on, they introduced salt-based nicotine devices. And we're going to talk about freebase first. So freebase nicotine, this is the same type of nicotine that's been used for decades in cigars, pipes, and combustible cigarettes. And so the very first e-cigarettes on the market, called minis or cigalikes, these are meant to imitate a combustible cigarette in their look, in their feel. There's actually a little LED light at the end of most of them that glows like an ember. The idea with these is to use them until they either lose charge or run out of juice. You throw them away, you buy another one. And there's a big range with them. They typically last, though, about 400 puffs, and big margin of error there, depending on folks' use patterns, how deeply they inhale, that kind of thing. So then we also have these mid-size rechargeable vape pens. These are appealing to a lot of folks because they're refillable. You can recharge them and add more liquid to them. And this is kind of an average size, and a 1.6 milliliter tank will last around 800 puffs. Then we get to the box mods. So box mods are interesting in a few ways. They're much more powerful, and they can be more powerful, I should say. Mod is short for modular or modified, and they tend to have either a much larger heating element or multiple small heating elements. What that means is you can have more power, you can draw more power, which can lead to a hotter and better quality vapor, and it's a more efficient, fast-acting delivery of nicotine. And so a lot of folks who advocate to use vaping as a way to quit smoking will recommend, we'll tease apart a lot of the science behind that later, but we'll recommend to use a box mod because it more closely emulates the sensation of smoking. These are really tied to vaping culture, so we're not going to show this now, but if anyone's curious, you can Google or YouTube like vaping competitions, and you'll see folks with this style that are blowing all these like vape rings or aerosol rings, doing all these tricks with them. If you're ever walking on the sidewalk or driving and you see someone in a car near you when there's this really thick, foggy plume coming out, they're very likely vaping a box mod. All right, so we're now shifting gears to talk about salt-based nicotine. So these are newer to the market. They entered the market in, I believe, 2016, starting with the infamous Juul. So a bit of context with this. This is a pH scale. Now, the human body has a neutral pH. We call that a pH of 7. And as a basic rule, the further away from neutral a substance is, either more acidic or more basic, the harsher that substance is to the human body. So free-base nicotine, that classic nicotine that we saw in the earlier models, earlier versions of these devices, it has a pH of around 8 to 8.5. So it's a little harsh, a little burny feeling. Now what they did with salt-based nicotine is they added an acid into the mix, and that brought the pH closer to that of the human body, so around 7, 7.5. That means that the nicotine itself is less aggravating to breathe in. So this plays out in a lot of different ways. One of them is that a user can have higher levels of nicotine and not have it feel as harsh with salt-based nicotine. This means that you can have a higher concentration of nicotine in the liquid, which means you need less liquid, so you don't have to have as large of a reservoir, you don't have to have as large of a heating element, and you don't have to have as large of a battery. So this means you can have a much smaller, sleeker product. And this is where Juul comes in, because they have this kind of, flash drive looking device. I'm sure everyone on here has at least seen pictures of. And this really changed the game for vaping. If you look at vaping rates up to this point, they were actually starting to decline, and then Juul entered the market and they skyrocketed. So Juul itself, it's designed to be rechargeable, so you can plug it in to get more power, but it's not designed to be refillable. Rather, folks are supposed to buy these pods or cartridges and just replace the old one. I want to correct a common misconception. So some folks, actually quite a few folks, depending on when we're talking about, have thought that they were using a Juul that had just flavor. And by and large, that is not a thing. Juul does not create a pod themselves that has no nicotine. So all Juul pods, depending on where it's purchased, will have either 3% or 5% nicotine in it. A 5% pod is more or less the same amount of nicotine as a pack of cigarettes. And they've been hit pretty hard the past few years with a lot of media campaigns, a lot of litigation happening. And still, even with all that backlash against them, as of last year, they still made up 60 to 70% of the retail market for vaping products. So they're still very, very, very powerful. But they're not the only salt-based nicotine devices. They sort of launched the scene, but then all these other products started coming out. So there are some, you'll see here, the Soren Drop. That's this kind of teardrop looking one at the top. There's the Smoke or Smock badge on the lower right there. These ones are refillable and rechargeable, so folks can just buy salt-based liquid and refill it on their own. So they're growing in popularity as well. And then fairly recently, actually, following the federal flavor ban, this one company called Puff Bar took advantage of a loophole in that regulation. That loophole was that this only applied to, the flavor ban only applied to non-disposable devices. So they went ahead and created a disposable salt-based device. So the industry is pretty darn crafty, and they're very good at taking advantage of loopholes like that. All right, I'm going to morph into regulation. Please hit me with any questions on the devices, and I'll answer as I can. So here's a bit of a timeline. 2007, this is when the very, very, very first vape products hit the US market. And then all these years later is when the FDA finally finalized regulatory authority over these products. That was in 2016. Now, 2017 comes by and FDA declares that manufacturers, they're going to have to submit their product for review to be approved by the FDA, but they didn't originally have to until 2022. And in this 2-year gap from 2016 to 2018, they did start adding more regulations. So in 18 and over, 18, goodness, I cannot speak today. My apologies. 18 years or older purchase restriction, adding some health warnings, as well as laying out those plans for the future regulations. So now, 2018 is when the youth e-cigarette use was labeled as an epidemic. Now, November of that year, the FDA started adding a little more oversight, a little more restrictions. By July of 2019, a federal judge actually ruled that the FDA acted illegally by allowing these products to remain unreviewed until 2022. So then they had to up their renewal date to May of this year. That was the original plan. But everything with COVID pushed this back even further. So now the new review date is September of 2020. All right. Oh, and then to complicate things further, always more happening. January of this year, we have seen T21 pass both in Washington and federal level. So that's ages 21 and up for accessing these products. There's also that federal flavor policy that I mentioned. All right, now we're going to morph into some nicotine-specific public health issues. So one of the big caveats with all this is that we have a lot of research that looks to see what these specific chemicals are in these devices. We also have other research that has charted and tracked that these specific chemicals can cause these specific injuries. What we don't always have, though, what we don't have very much of, I should say, is research that shows that vaping these specific chemicals can lead to these specific injuries. And we don't have much long-term longitudinal data just yet. So this is something we're hoping to see more, but as of now, we have to take a grain of salt with a lot of our evidence-based conclusions. What we do know, though, and this is part of what we know at least, is that when we're looking at acute effects of nicotine, this is just the nicotine side of things, this can be very toxic. So a one teaspoon, 36 milligrams of nicotine per milliliter of e-juice bottle. This concentration can be a lethal dose for a 20-pound baby. What makes this even freakier is a lot of these e-juices, especially the flavored ones, they smell sweet, and folks who have tasted them report that they taste sweet. So there's very little to deter a kid from thinking, oh, this is candy, oh, this is juice. So that's pretty alarming right there. One of the other concerns that's kind of unique to vaping, regardless of the substance, is the presence of what we call ultra-fine particles. So the aerosol itself is a big concern. When you're looking at the particle size of smoke and comparing it to particle size of vape aerosol, you tend to see more of these ultrafine particles in that vaping or aerosol plume. Now, what's so freaky with these is because they're so much smaller than smoke particles, they can actually travel further into the lungs, bypassing a lot of the lungs' natural defenses. And they can get into the bloodstream at higher concentrations, higher levels. So whatever that chemical is, there is a greater concern for any negative effects to take place. Now we're going to talk about all of these, at least to a degree, but we're going to focus on nicotine first. As a side note, you might be wondering why we have these little cartoony images here. For those who haven't checked it out, I really recommend you look at this website, Escape the Vape, specifically if you'd like some education material for younger kids. There's some really excellent stuff there. So talking first about nicotine. As I just said, there's a big concern about the absorption rate of nicotine. And one of the big concerns with smoking is there's a lot of rhetoric about folks struggling with addiction to smoking, but there's not always follow-up rhetoric of saying, actually, that addiction isn't to smoking, it's to nicotine. So focusing on nicotine for a moment, the idea behind this chart is to compare sort of an average unit of a combustible cigarette product, comparing that to an average unit of a vape device. So this is looking at a pack of cigarettes, which is typically 20 cigarettes, comparing that to a jewel pod. So when you look at just the nicotine levels in that, you have a total of 240 milligrams of nicotine in a pack of cigarettes. You have a total of 41.3 milligrams of nicotine per individual jewel pod, right? So because of the difference in the absorption, because of the size of the particles comparing between smoke and aerosol, there is a greater likelihood of absorbing more total nicotine from vaping when compared to smoking. So a lot of research suggests that the average cigarette user absorbs around 1 milligram of nicotine per cigarette. So that's 1/12 of the total nicotine in there. When you're comparing to a jewel pod, however, you can absorb so much more. So depending on what study you're looking at, assuming a certain level of efficiency, an entire pack of cigarettes, a typical user might absorb a little over 20 milligrams of nicotine total. Whereas a vape, someone who's vaping, specifically a jewel pod, they may absorb close to or up to 38.8 milligrams of nicotine. So setting everything else aside, there is a greater concern for nicotine exposure from vaping than there is from smoking. So I mentioned dependence a moment ago, and I think it's important for us to take a moment and just define what do we mean when we say dependence. So dependence very loosely, or this is a broad definition for dependence, it occurs when your body or your brain starts to rely on some external outside substance to maintain a normal function. So my kind of silly example with this is my own relationship with coffee, which is really a dependence on caffeine. Now, I used to hate coffee, and then college happened, and then I got very into coffee. And over time, I started to have more and more coffee, this external substance, to maintain my normal function of staying awake and studying and learning. And because I needed more and more over time, that means I was developing a tolerance when your body starts to become more tolerant of a given substance, and you need more and more to maintain that normal function. Now, whenever dependence sets in, reducing or quitting that substance leads to withdrawal, and that can be a huge range of symptoms. So for myself, if I just stopped drinking coffee today, and I definitely had plenty this morning, but if I hadn't, I probably would be a lot more lethargic. I might have a headache, might be a little cranky, a little irritable, and so withdrawal symptoms can take many forms. Now, addiction, very loosely, is when that physical dependence starts to disrupt other aspects of life. And dependence in of itself is a symptom of addiction. Okay, so looking at dependence and addiction for nicotine specifically. Nicotine reaches the brain within seconds, especially when it's inhaled. It interacts with the brain's reward system, which releases dopamine. For any chemical or neurotransmitter nerds out there, dopamine is really, really, really tied to that sense of reinforcement. It feels good. So if I have, I had a burger for lunch today, and boy, did I feel good after that burger. So that was my body rewarding me for taking in nutrients, albeit kind of questionable nutrients, but there we go. Now, I think it's important to acknowledge that there are these quote unquote positive effects of nicotine. Folks get a sense of reward from nicotine. So there's that pleasure side that's tied to the dopamine, but there's also a very palpable decrease in stress and anxiety, and it is very fast acting. There's also an element of mood control and mood stabilization that can happen. And because those low doses of nicotine can act as a stimulant, it can help improve concentration for folks. All right, a little more on nicotine dependence. So nicotine, your body breaks it down really fast. It has a relatively short half-life. The length of time I've heard is about half an hour. And so this leads us to craving more and more and more and more. And over time, when someone really develops this dependency, they actually increase their level of brain receptors that react to nicotine. This creates a feedback loop, making those cravings even more intense. And repeated exposure to this actually can alter our processes attached to learning, to stress, and to self-control, which makes a lot of sense. If you program your brain to deal with stress by this external supply of nicotine and indirectly dopamine increase, when you take that away, of course your brain is going to get real mad at you. And so nicotine withdrawal symptoms can be extremely intense. It can include difficulty concentrating. You're losing this stimulant that you've relied on to focus with. Folks can get really irritable. They can go through depression. They can have this restlessness, this anxiety, and interestingly, insomnia. So if we bring this up for a few reasons, but really the main is that while there's this larger question of like folks wanting to vape because they feel it's safer than smoking, and vaping still has this element of nicotine. And so that dependency, that addiction is not going to be broken by switching from smoking to vaping. All right, I'm going to take a moment and look and see if there are any questions so far. How long does a vape unit last? Do people use it as long as it takes to smoke a cigarette? Never smoked or vape, so I have no baseline. That's a really good question, and I don't have a great answer for you, really, because there's a huge range depending on the user. Some folks will do very deep inhales. Some folks will do very short, rapid inhales, and all of this can alter how long it takes to go through a cigarette, to go through a Juul pod or other vape device. And a lot of it also depends on an individual's given tolerance level. Excellent question. I'm sorry if that's not the most satisfying answer, but it really just does depend on the user and on what they're using. All right, so some other concerns we have within this e-juice, this aerosol, is nitrosamines. So nitrosamines, these are one of the main carcinogens or cancer-causing agents that are in combustible cigarettes. We've known about these for years and years and years, and we're starting to identify a lot of these common nitrosamines in e-liquid as well. Propylene glycol. So propylene glycol, this is it's used to get the suspension right in that liquid. And it's a little tricky because it is FDA approved as safe, but only for ingestion, not for inhalation. So this brings it back to that, how something may be fine in one route of exposure, but may be toxic in another. Heavy metals, we're now able to trace that there are heavy metals that we can find in these e-juices. And really what we think this comes from are the metal components or the filaments in the device itself. And these tend to be at higher levels of concentration with newer devices. So if you take, this is one concern about juuling, is because you're constantly replacing those metal components with a new cartridge or a new pod, you're constantly then getting like a higher level of these leached heavy metals. Each of these can cause a whole plethora of other issues. We also have a concern with flavoring. So even if someone is truly just vaping a flavored product and with no nicotine, the flavors aren't exactly benign. So diacetyl specifically, I don't know if, for any who has not heard of diacetyl, this is what causes what is called popcorn lung. So diacetyl is another agent that is FDA approved for ingestion, but not for inhalation. And folks realized that this was a problem when they found workers in factories for microwave popcorn. Actually, they noticed a lot of their workers, because they were breathing this product in, they were getting these lesions that developed through their airways. And that same flavor, diacetyl, shows up in artificial butter flavor, as well as, weirdly enough, strawberry. It's very common in strawberry. Right, we also can see free radicals, which are another type of cancer-causing agent. We can see silicon, which can cause silicosis, all sorts of nasty stuff in the lungs there, as well as other carcinogens. And so any of these on their own is of concern, but what we really don't know, and what we're very alarmed to learn about, is the potential combined effect of all of these. All right, so we're now going to talk just very briefly about some other concerns with nicotine vaping. So secondhand exposure. This is very similar to secondhand smoke, and this is where you secondhand is whatever one breathes out. So the smoke or the aerosol that someone breathes out after smoking or vaping, that is a secondhand emission. And we can find amounts of formaldehyde, acetone, and acetal. Oh, I can never say this right. Acetal. Oh, I'm not even going to try. This is the third one right here. And these are all cancer-causing as well. Now there's this emerging field looking at third-hand exposure. So second-hand exposure is what you breathe out. Third-hand exposure is when those particles settle after a while. So if you walk into an elevator, for example, and you notice that kind of funky, smoky smell, there's a good chance you are having a third-hand exposure contact. And so there's this one study that looked at third-hand residue on various surfaces, specifically from nicotine aerosol, and they actually found measurable amounts of nicotine, the most actually on tiled floor. This is particularly concerning if there are little kids in the house who spend a lot more time closer to the ground. So if this is settling, say, in a carpet or on the ground and the kid's crawling around, they may be getting an unintentional nicotine exposure. Okay, so I mentioned cessation a little bit ago. There are a lot of very mixed perspectives on this, and at this point in time, there is insufficient evidence to back the claim that an ENDS product can act as a tobacco cessation tool. Some studies that do show success with this, from what I have seen, they actually come from various areas of Europe, which have a very, very, very different landscape for advertising than the US does. So the United States, we can get away with advertising a lot more than a lot of other countries. And that right there totally changes the landscape, changes the normalization. And so right now, there's not good evidence to say, yes, this is an effective cessation tool, especially compared to FDA-approved tobacco cessation treatments. All right, a little bit on gateway effect. The idea of gateway is that you use one substance and it leads to using other substances. So with vaping as a gateway, there actually is some pretty robust evidence to show that vaping increases your likelihood of later initiating combustible tobacco products. This is specifically for youth and adults. And digging into this even more, there's actually some pretty powerful evidence to show that for folks who have smoked ever, if they vape as well, they are likely to later on smoke more and at higher intensity and higher frequency. So there is this sense that vaping can be a gateway to combustible cigarettes. And a lot of especially the initial marketing of vaping was that this can be a substitute for cigarettes. All right, and lastly, we definitely have youth-specific concerns. So I talked a lot about addiction there. And the earlier someone uses any substance, nicotine included, the greater the likelihood that they're going to develop a problematic addiction to it. We talked about a lot of the processes that nicotine can affect, that concentration, that learning, that focus, that sense of reward. Well, this is especially critical if it's thrown in during adolescence, during this period of brain development. And so it could potentially have these very long-term consequences and effects on all of these processes: mood, learning, memory, and attention. Okay, I'm gonna take a quick sip of water and we're gonna morph on into cannabis. Hit me with any questions while I take just a few seconds to sip some water. All right, I'm not seeing a deluge of questions, so I'm gonna just keep on going. So for any who tuned in last week, some of this is going to be review, so just bear with me here. We're gonna now talk about cannabis. And first and foremost, I wanna get this caveat out of the way. You're gonna hear me mainly use the term cannabis. I may say marijuana a couple times. You have also heard pot and weed and all these others. There are definitely differences in nuance and stigma and history with all these terms, and at the end of the day, they refer to the same substance. They refer to the same plant and drug. So this plant, first and foremost, is it's called cannabis sativa. This one plant can be used to create a variety of different products. So there are non-psychoactive versions of this plant that we generally call hemp, that's used to create rope and soap and textiles and all sorts of stuff. There are also these other versions that we can use to create drug products. And again, they're also known as marijuana, pot, and all these other terms. So these drug products, some of them are psychoactive. That means mind-altering, intoxicating. Others, we don't believe, are psychoactive. And again, to complicate it further, they're all called cannabis. All right, so cannabis acts off of what we call the endocannabinoid system. And now this system, we call it a neuromodulatory system, and that means that it helps regulate and interact with a bunch of other body systems, and it specifically tells these other systems to kind of calm down when they're getting a little too excited. So a cannabinoid, that's a general term for a chemical compound that binds to these endocannabinoid receptors. And everyone on this call, every human, every mammal has this system in them right now. Because of that, they have what we call endocannabinoids. These are naturally produced by the body in them right now. Now, there are these other cannabinoids we call phytocannabinoids. These are plant-based or plant-derived. We see most of them coming from cannabis, but we can also see some coming from cacao, from echinacea, a couple others there. Now, we think that this system, this endocannabinoid system, by directly interacting with and regulating chemicals and neurotransmitters in the body and brain, that it indirectly regulates a whole bunch of systems, such as stress and anxiety behaviors, how we learn, how we form and store and retain memories, how we process reward. There's that dopamine again. THC does have an effect on dopamine, and a whole bunch others of other systems. All right, so there are tons and tons of cannabinoids, well over 100 these days that we've identified. We're mainly going to talk about these two, THC and CBD. So THC is delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol. It is the main psychoactive or intoxicating component of cannabis. This is what leads to that sensation of being high. There's also CBD, cannabidiol or cannabidiol. This has there's been a lot of rhetoric around CBD the past few years. In of itself, we don't believe it's psychoactive, but we think it can interact with and alter effects of other cannabinoids such as THC. All right, so all cannabis or marijuana products have cannabinoids in them. Some of them will focus on one cannabinoid over another, so some might just have CBD, some might just have THC, some will have a combination, and some will have many of those other cannabinoids that we haven't even discussed today. So it's very difficult to compare cannabis. There's so many different types and strains and formulations. There are plenty of modes of use, but we're mainly going to talk about vaping and a little bit on dabbing. So there are two main types of vaped cannabis. There is dried flower or bud. That's a less processed version of this plant. And typically this has a THC concentration of around 5 to 30%. Now concentrates, on the other hand, as the name implies, have a much, much higher concentration of THC. There are two main classifications. There's the solid concentrates, often referred to as butane hash oil. It's just one method of extraction. And then there are these oil or liquid-based concentrates, such as CO2 oil. And we've given a ballpark range here of 50 to 90% THC, depending on the product, depending on the purity. Well, I have seen products that are in the like 95, 96%. Okay, so now talking about some devices specific to cannabis. These really mirror the nicotine-based devices a lot. So these ones, sometimes these are called e-joints. These are very much like those minis or cigalikes. They're disposable. You use them until either the power drains or you run out of liquid. You throw them away and you buy new ones. There are the CO2 oil vape pens. These ones specifically use that liquid concentrate, and they tend to come in these cartridges. So they're reusable, they're rechargeable. Sometimes they're refillable, but generally, kind of like a Juul pod, someone will just buy a new pre-filled cartridge. Now you'll notice this center image here that looks suspiciously like a Juul pod. That if you held them side by side, this thing's called packs. If you held it side by side with a Juul, they are slightly different in their shape and their size, but they are similar. And PAX actually used to own Juul, used to own that company. And I think it's important just to note, if you see anyone using this device that has this little X-like symbol, they are very, very, very likely going to be vaping a cannabis product or a THC oil rather than a Juul pod, because these cartridges, these pods are not interchangeable between these devices. All right, so there are other types of vape pens that use those solid concentrates. They're also reusable, rechargeable. They generally have this chamber, and someone will add that solid concentrate right on top of that coil there, rather than replacing a whole cartridge like that. I don't think these are as popular. These are the dried flower or bud vape pens. So this will take that dried flower or bud, that plant material, and it's a similar process where it heats it just to the point where the oils start to aerosolize. The oils that are in and around the plant start to aerosolize, and folks will breathe in that way. Now there are fancier, more expensive vape pens that are multi-use. So these generally come with different components that allows them to either vape a concentrated product or dried flower or bud. They tend to be a lot more expensive because of their versatility. We put together a little kit for education, cannabis kit for education, and we have this one on the bottom here called the PAX 3. And when we bought it in Seattle a couple years back, it was about $300. And our colleague in Eastern Washington, Spokane, found one for about $200. All right, so just a little bit on dabbing. We're getting toward 3 o'clock already. So a little bit on dabbing. Tricky thing with dabbing is a lot of folks will use the term dab and the term vape interchangeably. The way we see dabbing, though, is it's a similar process, but uses much higher temperatures, much higher heat. And what we've seen is folks will heat this device, this dab rig is what it's called, up to about 750 to 900 degrees Fahrenheit. And so typically, there's a picture of a blowtorch because they'll use a blowtorch here. So you see this little, kind of hard to, I don't think my cursor will go through there, but you'll see this little, what we call a nail here. That's where the actual concentrate goes. So that's what's superheated with the blowtorch. The concentrate is placed there, and this whole chamber will be filled with water. So then someone would put their mouth on the mouthpiece and breathe through. And that very, 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 very concentrated plume becomes even more concentrated as it goes through the water because it cools and condenses. So there's a greater release of chemicals and it's more rapid. And there's a concern, not just for getting a very high dose, because that definitely is a concern because it's such a concentrated product delivered so quickly. There's also a concern for burns. I feel like anytime someone is mixing intoxication with blowtorch, it's kind of a bad recipe there. Now, folks may not have heard of this. This is called a nectar collector. We only learned of this ourselves pretty recently. It's kind of similar in a sense to dabbing, where you would superheat the end of this with a blowtorch, but it's much smaller. So some of them are just this sort of straight tube, kind of like a straw essentially. Some of them, like this kind of turquoise and green one here, actually does have a water chamber in the middle, so it does do some cooling and condensing. But you'll superheat the end of this and stick it right to a little puddle, a little pool of that concentrated product. And so we don't know, we don't have any data on this. This is just information given to us by various bud tenders and smoke shop workers. But according to them, it's a much harsher hit, which makes sense because there would be so much less ability for it to cool off before breathing it. All right, hit me with any questions on those devices. We're going to talk just a little bit about cannabis legality. So cannabis is odd in that it is federally illegal. It is a Schedule I drug, which means that the federal government views cannabis as having no medical or therapeutic value, as well as a high potential for abuse or for addiction, for dependence. And it's been this way since the Controlled Substances Act was passed in 1970. Yet somehow, in spite of federal illegality, certain states, back in 1996, California was the first state to pass a medical marijuana laws, and then more and more states started following suit until 2012, when Washington and Colorado legalized what we call retail cannabis there. So this is a current snapshot of cannabis legalization in the U.S. So the green states here have both recreational or retail and medical. The blue states have just medical, and there are currently 33 states with just medical, 11 states with both retail and medical, Washington, D.C. as well. And we expect many more to legalize coming this fall of 2020. A little bit on CBD. So part of why we saw this almost overnight explosion of CBD products has to do with the 2018 Farm Bill. So hemp is cannabis with less than 0.3% THC. Thus, on its own, it's not psychoactive. Before this Farm Bill, it was on the Controlled Substances Act. It was also a Schedule I drug, so it had the same level of regulation. Well, what the Farm Bill did was it removed hemp from that act entirely. So what this means is that hemp producers can now legally derive CBD from their hemp. And this is why they're, in beginning in 2019, CBD products just sort of saturated the market in a variety of locations, not just cannabis retailers. So looking at Washington legality, even though we have retail legalization, there are still restrictions. So folks can legally only purchase from licensed retailers. Folks have to be at least 21 years or older to not just purchase, but to possess or use. All states that have a retail infrastructure like this have gone with age 21 as their benchmark. It is still illegal to use in public, to drive under the influence. It's just called a DUI with cannabis rather than a DUI. It's illegal to take across state and tribal lines, even if you're trying to take it into a state with similar legality. So take Oregon, for example. Oregon has both retail and medical legality. One cannot legally take Washington cannabis into Oregon or vice versa. It is also illegal to use cannabis on federally regulated lands within the state of Washington. So if you went to Rainier National Park or Olympic National Park, you would not be able to legally take cannabis with you because federal jurisdiction applies. Now we have a couple of these logos here we wanted to bring to your attention. This big hand that says not for kids, this is required to be on all cannabis edible and drinkable products. And this actually has the poison center number here. So the idea behind this is to educate adults in the household and let them know, hey, this is a dangerous product for youth. Store it safely, out of reach, out of sight, so youth don't unintentionally get into it. Now this other logo here, this big cannabis leaf with the yellow diamond around it, this is Washington's universal THC logo. So any product containing more than 0.3% THC is by law required to have this symbol on it. This symbol does not have to go on the devices though, because the devices are generally sold separately from the THC product. Okay, so we're now going to talk just a little bit, because we're running low on time, a little bit about cannabis-specific public health. So one of the first is that very similar to what we were saying about nicotine, there's not as much research as we would like. And that's not just about vaping cannabis, that's about cannabis in almost any form. Because it's a Schedule I substance, it's very difficult to get approval, federal approval, to research it. So research, if it is approved, it's generally on low dose smoked cannabis. And while that tells us a great deal about low dose smoked cannabis, it tells us nothing about all these other products that are generally high dose and all these other methods of consumption, such as vaping. And having more and more and more variety here, having all these different types of products, complicates that research even further. So what we do know, we're now looking at acute clinical effects. Again, acute means short term, in the moment intoxication. Similar caveat of the route of ingestion, route of exposure, I shouldn't have said route of ingestion, the route of exposure, including ingestion, inhalation, and absorption. This can alter how the body processes this exposure. And so this is how the Poison Center categorizes cannabis exposure. These mild and moderate symptoms generally include sleepiness, so folks will just be real tired. Folks may experience euphoria, that means they're feeling particularly good. They may experience impaired time estimation, which has always struck me as so odd. This has popped up in the literature as well, where folks will feel like hours and hours have gone by, when in reality it's only been 15 minutes, half an hour. There can be a loss of social inhibition, giddiness, mood alterations, and decreased motor coordination. That last one is really important because that means no one should drive while using cannabis. Severe symptoms can include altered mental status. We can see dilated pupils, sort of this decreased tone, floppiness in the muscles. And in some instances, we've heard reports of little kids who had gone into a concentrated product and ended up in a coma. Now, luckily, those cases were temporary comas. They were all able to come out. And anytime coma's entering the game, I feel like we have a reason to be cautious. All right, so just a little bit on aerosol dangers with vaping cannabis specifically. There is this sense, for folks who have heard of EVALI, this was that big lung injury, which we sort of kind of went away from the media's rhetoric because of COVID. There was a link, an assumed link to vitamin E acetate. Now, vitamin E acetate, for a variety of reasons, it's more likely to appear in certain types of concentrates more than others. It's more likely to appear in like modified versions of BHO, that solid concentrate. There are a few reasons for that, so ask me questions on that if you'd like, but I'll keep moving on for now. There is also this exposure to cannabinoids, and we talked about some of the concerns for why we're cautious about especially kids being exposed to cannabinoids. And there could be other dangers here as well, but we're not fully sure. We really, really need more research in order to have a better grasp of this. So remember that slide I gave on dependence? This applies to cannabis as well. And there's a lot of rhetoric that cannabis is not physically dependent or physically addictive, or that it's not as addictive as these other drugs, such as heroin or nicotine. Well, and heroin and nicotine are two of the most addictive substances, period. So that's not a good bragging point if you're not as addictive as those. And cannabis users who report that they reduce or quit will often report that they experience withdrawal symptoms, and withdrawal implies dependence. So some common withdrawal symptoms for cannabis withdrawals could include sleep disruption, anxiety, irritability, depression or depressed mood, and headaches. And one of the tricky parts with these is we don't have time to go into it today, but a lot of these reasons are also reasons that folks seek out cannabis. So then you confuse not only the individual, but larger research when you have common withdrawal symptoms overlap with common reasons for use. We're getting real close to the end, folks. So cannabis as a gateway, I'm not going to read all this verbatim, it's pretty complicated, but essentially there is a correlation between cannabis and other substance use disorders, including alcohol, tobacco, and other substances. However, that we cannot infer causation from that. We cannot say cannabis causes alcohol use disorder, but we do see a correlation between the two. So again, we need more research to better tease that apart. We do see some direction though between tobacco use and cannabis use. So there is some evidence to show that using cannabis increases your likelihood of later starting to use tobacco, but it's actually stronger in the other direction. Using tobacco increases your chances of later starting to use cannabis. All right, a couple youth-specific concerns with cannabis. So that big, complicated endocannabinoid system we talked about, it is extraordinarily active during adolescence. It helps in a variety of ways with brain development, which is really like the hallmark of adolescence, right? So for youth and young adults, cannabis use can be correlated with overall cognitive and academic impairment. And again, I want to emphasize correlation, not causation here. The same factors that lead to cannabis use could also lead to academic impairment. We also can see correlations with problems with memory, attention, focus, and problem solving. We can see overall poorer school performance, lower grades, and we can see an increased risk of mental health issues such as depression, anxiety, and psychosis. So the evidence for each of those is a little different. And if anyone is interested in that larger cannabis presentation, we do have that recording, so that goes into it in a lot more detail. But I do want to say, regardless of the direction here, regardless of causation or correlation, I think youth use of cannabis can be a red flag that something else is going on. With that, we are just about at the end, folks. So there are just a couple resources here with some of the hyperlinks if folks would like to check them out. And this is my email address. So if anyone has any questions that they didn't put in the chat box here, or any comments, any feedback, any articles you think I should check out, I'm always trying to integrate more information into this and update the information I have. Please hit me up, let me know. So thank you all so much for joining today. And as always, it's a pleasure working with y'all. I'll stay on the line for just a couple more minutes just to see if anyone thinks of a last minute question here. All right, well, I'm not seeing any questions, so I think I'm gonna go ahead and close the webinar. Stay tuned for some follow-up from us, and we'll get you those slide links as well as the recording links. Thank you all so much, and I hope you all have an excellent day. Take care, all.